Donald Trump just lost Canada, not in rhetoric, not in diplomacy, not temporarily, but permanently. That is the clear and deliberate message delivered by Mark Carney. A declaration so precise, so strategically timed, that insiders in 3 separate G7 governments immediately called it the most significant shift in North American energy architecture since the 1973 oil crisis. Carney didn't hint at energy independence from the United States. He stated it as fact, completed, and irreversible. He reinforced that statement with concrete policy tools, redirected markets, and international partnerships, signaling in unmistakable terms that Canada has made a sovereign choice to reconfigure its energy relationships at a foundational level. Trump reacted predictably, but the specific words, the threats, and the timeline of his response revealed more than anyone in the White House probably realized. This is not just a trade dispute, and it is not about tariffs. This is the beginning of a structural transformation of North American energy geography that will affect electricity prices, natural gas supply, industrial competitiveness, and even American foreign policy credibility for years, potentially decades. When a Canadian Prime Minister stands before Parliament and uses the word independence in the context of energy supply, and within minutes markets in New York, London, and Tokyo react, you know this is more than political theater. This is a strategic declaration with operational consequences. And yes, you should hit that subscribe button, because every development here affects every American household paying an energy bill. So how did we get here? On March 17, 2026, Mark Carney addressed a joint session of the Canadian Parliament in Ottawa, promising a major announcement on Canadian economic sovereignty. Journalists had no advance text, allied governments were not briefed, and the American Embassy in Ottawa, along with the State Department in Washington, received no prior warning. Sources described this blackout as itself a message. Canada was no longer consulting Washington before making sovereign decisions about its resources. For 41 minutes, Carney outlined what would soon be formalized as the Sovereign Energy Declaration of 2026, a comprehensive 7-point framework designed to ensure that Canadian energy policy would never again be subject to American leverage. The declaration reoriented Canada's energy export strategy away from the U.S. as the default customer and toward a diversified portfolio of international buyers, infrastructure investments, and regulatory structures. These measures were designed to prevent any future American administration from using Canadian energy dependency as a bargaining chip in negotiations. This is far more than political controversy. Canada supplies roughly 60% of American crude oil imports, provides natural gas to millions of homes in the Northeast and Midwest, and delivers hydroelectric power under long-term contracts to states including New York, Vermont, Maine, and Minnesota. The country that Trump repeatedly suggested should become the 51st state has just made a historic declaration. It will no longer center the United States as its primary energy market. When your largest energy supplier declares independence, you know history has been permanently altered. The tension had been building since February 2026, when Trump repeatedly suggested Canada should accept American trade terms, often referencing Canadian energy exports as something the U.S. could replace. While replacing Canadian crude and gas in the near term is logistically impossible, these comments revealed a broader mindset. Washington viewed Canadian energy as leverage, not interdependency. That difference in perspective set the stage for decisive action. Everything escalated on March 12, 2026, when a White House economic briefing outlined a scenario in which the U.S. might weaponize energy supply infrastructure as a bargaining tool against Ottawa. Canadian officials immediately understood the implication. If the U.S. was willing to use Canadian energy as a negotiating threat, Ottawa needed to ensure structurally and permanently that no single buyer, including the United States, could hold veto power over Canadian energy policy. Carney and his team had been planning this framework since January, and March 17th was the day to execute it. Now, let's dive into the heart of the Sovereign Energy Declaration. This wasn't symbolic theater, it was a calculated blueprint, designed with precision and intended to produce immediate and lasting effects. Each of the 7 points carried specific policy tools with tangible economic consequences for American stakeholders. Inside Canada's Natural Resources Ministry, Sources described the framework as deliberately sequenced, not by economic size, but by political impact. The measures most likely to provoke an immediate reaction in the U.S. were placed first, ensuring Washington would be flooded with responses from domestic constituencies before Trump even had a chance to react publicly. The first point was the revival and acceleration of the Energy East pipeline corridor, a long-discussed east-west route that allows Alberta crude oil to reach the Atlantic tidewaters at St. John, New Brunswick. From there, Canadian oil could be exported to Europe and Asia without ever transiting U.S. territory. This project, shelved since 2017, suddenly received federal regulatory fast-tracking and an initial capital commitment of 14.7 billion Canadian dollars. The impact was immediate. American refiners in the Midwest, dependent on Alberta crude through existing north-south pipelines, registered the announcement instantly. The second point was a formal agreement with the European Union, signed in Brussels on March 15th but embargoed until Carney's address, establishing Canada as a priority supplier of liquefied natural gas to European markets via a new LNG terminal in Goldboro, Nova Scotia. Germany, the Netherlands, and France collectively committed to purchasing 12 billion cubic meters of Canadian LNG annually by 2031. For years, Europe had sought alternatives to Russian gas, while Canada had hesitated to invest in the required infrastructure. Carney's statement made clear that hesitation was over. The press gallery remained silent for 4 seconds, the kind of pause that marks history in motion. The third point addressed hydroelectric power sales to the U.S. Northeast. New York, Vermont, Maine, and Minnesota had long benefited from preferential long-term agreements with Hydro-Quebec and other provincial utilities. Carney announced a review of these agreements, proposing market-based renegotiations. New capacity would be allocated first to Canadian industrial users and then to international buyers, with American utilities entering a competitive bidding process rather than receiving preferential treatment. Governors in those states learned of this news even before Carney finished his speech, and calls to provincial energy offices poured in immediately. The fourth point established a Canadian critical minerals sovereignty reserve. This regulatory framework gives the federal government the authority to review and restrict export permits for lithium, cobalt, nickel, and rare earth elements whenever exports conflict with national economic interests. While the concept had been debated since 2023, embedding it formally in the Sovereign Energy Declaration gave it unprecedented permanence. American defense contractors and technology manufacturers reacted in real time, recognizing the new constraints on their supply chains. The fifth point strengthened Canada's ties with Asia. Bilateral energy agreements with Japan and South Korea, two of the world's largest LNG importers, formalized Canadian supply commitments through Pacific-facing infrastructure in British Columbia. These negotiations had been underway since late 2025, but announcing them alongside the Sovereign Energy Declaration signaled a deliberate strategic pivot. Canada was redirecting energy away from the United States while simultaneously locking in critical supply relationships with U.S. allies. The sixth and seventh points were domestic but crucial. They involved internal Canadian energy market restructuring and provincial coordination mechanisms. Though primarily domestic in impact, their inclusion underscored that this was not a temporary, reactive move. This was a permanent, institutionalized policy shift, unlikely to be undone by any future government. By the end of Carney's 4 one-minute address, Canadian energy stocks surged. Alberta oil sands companies saw a 6 to 9% rise on the TSX. LNG infrastructure firms climbed sharply, and provincial energy ministers from British Columbia, Alberta, and Quebec publicly endorsed the framework within hours. The historical context makes this moment even more remarkable. Consider 1973, when Arab OPEC members imposed an oil embargo on the U.S., causing gasoline shortages, price spikes of 300%, and one of the most severe recessions between the Great Depression and 2008. The United States did not control its energy supply and suffered the consequences. Canada is not OPEC, and it is not imposing an embargo. But by building permanent alternative infrastructure and diversifying markets, Canada is achieving something potentially more consequential, removing American leverage over Canadian energy not for months, but for generations. Pipelines, LNG terminals, and supply agreements are not reversible political statements. They are physical and commercial realities that fundamentally reshape North American energy geography. Then came the American response, and this is where the story becomes explosive. At 2:34 p.m. on March 17th, Trump posted on Truth Social, "In its entirety, Canada just made the biggest mistake in their history. We don't need their energy. We have more oil and gas than anyone. I will impose immediate 50% tariffs on all Canadian energy products, effective in 30 days unless this ridiculous declaration is reversed. Carney is a fool. He will regret this. America first always." Just 12 minutes later, the White House press office confirmed that the Department of Energy and the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative were directed to prepare the tariff instruments. Markets reacted within minutes, but not in the way the White House intended. American natural gas futures spiked 5.7% in the first hour of trading, heating oil prices surged, and utility stocks in the Northeast fell between 3 and 7%. The reason was straightforward. Threatening tariffs does nothing to replace Canadian supply. It simply raises the cost of energy for American consumers and businesses, while the underlying supply reality remains unchanged. Infrastructure to replace Canadian energy cannot be built in 30 days or even 30 months. Analysts describe the administration's position as self-constructed. Enforcing the 50% tariffs would immediately burden American households in the Northeast, where 4.8 million homes rely on Canadian natural gas and hydroelectric power. Home heating costs, electricity bills, and industrial energy prices would rise sharply, particularly impacting marginal Republican states where political consequences are most visible. On the flip side, if the administration backs down from the tariff threat after publicly announcing it, credibility is eroded. American economic pressure as a diplomatic tool would weaken, diminishing leverage not just against Canada but globally. Every government that saw Washington's initial post, Canada, the EU, Japan, South Korea, would note that threats could be ignored without consequence. The net effect? A permanent reduction in American leverage over Canadian energy policy. Experts have called this the most consequential Canadian policy announcement in relation to the United States since the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement of 1988. Michael Ignatieff, former leader of Canada's Liberal Party and former director of the Carr Centre for Human Rights Policy at Harvard, told the BBC that Carney created facts on the ground that cannot be undone by tweets or tariff threats. The infrastructure investments, European and Pacific supply agreements, and regulatory frameworks have created political and economic constituencies that will resist reversal as strongly as they currently support the declaration. Even within U.S. energy circles, the reaction was nuanced. The American Petroleum Institute declined to endorse the 50% tariff, instead calling for immediate bilateral negotiations. They noted that Midwest refiners had built facilities specifically for Canadian heavy crude, making replacement impractical in any realistic timeframe. The vulnerabilities exposed by the declaration are profound. First, northeastern home heating. A 50% tariff on Canadian natural gas would immediately raise costs for nearly 5 million households, hitting politically sensitive states. Second, industrial energy in the Midwest. Canadian hydroelectric power and natural gas supply vital to manufacturing operations, steel, chemicals, automotive, and food processing would become costlier, reducing competitiveness internationally. Third, critical minerals and defense supply chains. Canada's creation of a critical minerals sovereignty reserve gives Ottawa authority to review export permits for lithium, cobalt, nickel, and rare earth elements. These materials are essential to EV batteries, military electronics, and advanced tech, and American manufacturers now face potential regulatory restrictions. Congressional committees have requested classified briefings, recognizing the strategic risk. Beyond immediate market and supply impacts, the declaration is about permanence. Pipelines built to tidewaters, LNG terminals constructed for Europe and Asia, and long-term supply agreements are irreversible under normal political cycles. These physical and commercial realities reshape North American energy geography, reducing U.S. leverage for a generation. Carney's declaration was designed to create these irreversible facts quickly, using the political window created by Trump's confrontational approach to maximize domestic Canadian support for the necessary investments. Polls conducted on March 17, 18 showed 71% Canadian support for the declaration, including 64% of conservative voters, reflecting a cross-partisan consensus on economic sovereignty. The American response has not gone unnoticed. On March 18th, the Council on Foreign Relations published a commentary noting that Atlantic LNG infrastructure, Pacific supply agreements, and European commitments represented a permanent shift in Canadian energy export orientation. They warned that Washington's window to engage diplomatically before the infrastructure becomes irreversible is narrowing. Over the next 30 to 60 days, developments in bond markets, energy futures, congressional hearings, and diplomatic channels will determine whether this confrontation permanently redraws North American energy geography. The stakes couldn't be higher. 3 days after Trump's Truth Social post, on March 20th, the governors of New York, Vermont, Maine, Minnesota, and Massachusetts sent a joint letter to the White House, publicly urging the suspension of the 50% energy tariff threat and demanding direct negotiations with Ottawa. Their message was clear: if Washington continued down this confrontational path, state governments would be forced to explore emergency energy procurement alternatives, potentially further complicating U.S.-Canada relations. The letter was bipartisan, specific, and firm, a rare public rebuke from American state executives that highlighted just how serious the domestic fallout from the tariff threat could be. The White House, however, has yet to respond publicly. Inside the administration, the energy tariff debate is reportedly one of the most hotly contested policy discussions in the West Wing. Economic advisors warn of the immediate cost impact on consumers, while political instincts push for a show of resolve. No resolution has been reached, and the 30-day tariff countdown is ticking. Meanwhile, Canadian infrastructure decisions are moving ahead at pace. Regulatory fast-tracking for the Energy East pipeline, project approval processes in Alberta, and development timelines for the Goldbur LNG terminal are all proceeding alongside the formal execution of European offtake agreements. Each step locks in structural facts that will shape North American energy for decades. Pipelines will either be built or not. LNG terminals will either be operational or not. Supply agreements with Germany, Japan, and South Korea will either be enforced or remain dormant. These are decisions being made in boardrooms and government offices across Calgary, Ottawa, Halifax, and Brussels, far beyond the reach of social media threats. Mark Carney's declaration has created a permanent shift. Canada is constructing the infrastructure, signing contracts, and formalizing regulatory frameworks to ensure no American administration can ever again use Canadian energy as leverage. Trump's threatened tariffs, meanwhile, have highlighted vulnerabilities without offering solutions. Energy markets are already pricing in tighter supply. State governors are demanding negotiation. American energy industry groups are refusing to endorse the threat. Congressional committees are reviewing critical mineral supply chain exposure, and domestic Canadian support for the declaration remains robust at 71% and rising. The broader lesson is clear. Infrastructure shapes political reality. Pipelines to tidewaters, LNG terminals to Europe and Asia, and binding supply agreements create permanent alternatives to the United States as a primary customer. This reduces American influence over Canadian energy for generations, regardless of future political administrations in either country. Carney's strategy capitalized on a unique political window created by Trump's confrontational approach, ensuring Canadian domestic political support for long-term investment while solidifying Canada's sovereign control over energy policy. The 30-day tariff clock is running. The Energy East pipeline's regulatory fast-tracking, Goldbur LNG terminal development, and European supply agreements are accelerating. Northeastern governors are monitoring the federal response, aware that any delay or inaction could intensify political pressure in Congress. This is no longer a bilateral spat over energy. It is a structural, irreversible realignment of North American energy architecture. Canada has moved decisively to build a future where energy dependency no longer constrains sovereignty, while the U.S. struggles to respond without undermining its own consumers, industry, and political credibility. This story is defining the next generation of energy relations on the continent. The decisions being made right now in Canadian and international boardrooms combined with the infrastructure and contracts already in motion, will permanently change pricing, market access, and the balance of leverage for decades. The implications touch every American household that pays an energy bill, every manufacturer dependent on competitive energy prices, and every technology or defense contractor reliant on critical minerals. Canada's declaration is not temporary, reactive, or symbolic. It is operational, binding, and transformative. The window to prevent this permanent shift is narrowing, and every day that passes solidifies the new North American energy geography. Hit that like button if this analysis is helping you understand the stakes, because this story isn't slowing down. You are witnessing the unfolding of a structural transformation that will define energy, economic, and geopolitical relations across the continent for generations. Mark Carney has acted decisively, and Trump's response has revealed just how constrained, reactive, and politically fraught American energy policy has become. Pipelines will be built, LNG terminals will go online, European and Asian supply agreements will be executed, and the 30-day tariff clock is ticking. Every moment counts, and every action will reverberate for decades to come.